Most passport rankings are measuring the wrong thing. They'll tell you Singapore has the world's most powerful passport, followed by Japan, then South Korea. And those rankings shape how everyone thinks about passport strength, including people who are making serious decisions about a second citizenship. But when you apply the measures that actually matter for a Plan B, the hierarchy flips upside down. Passports at the top collapse, and passports further down turn out to be way more powerful than anyone realizes. In this video, I'll show you the 3 tests that matter, apply them to the world's top-ranked passports, and reveal the one that actually wins. And it's probably not the one you expect. So first off, what are these passport indexes actually measuring? Well, most of the time they're measuring tourist access, specifically short-stay visa-free entry, and that's the entire methodology. Most of the time, they're not measuring the right to live somewhere or the right to work or access healthcare and education, or the ability to build a life in another country. And to be fair, tourist access is not worthless. If you travel frequently for work, having visa-free entry to nearly 200 countries can be a real convenience. But a visa-free weekend in Tokyo and the legal right to move to Oslo and make a life there are not remotely comparable. And if you're building a second citizenship strategy based on tourist rankings, then you could be making a very expensive mistake. So what should you be measuring instead? Well, here are the 3 tests that any serious citizenship decision should pass. The first test is whether you can actually live and work in the country. Not just visit for a holiday, but genuinely settle there, work legally, access healthcare, and send your kids to school. The second test is how many countries that right covers, because there's a massive difference between having tourist access to 190 countries and the legal right to live in 32. And the third test is whether or not that passport allows dual citizenship, because if acquiring it means renouncing what you already have, then you're not really building a portfolio of options, but you're just swapping one limitation for another. Now, nobody realistically pursues Singaporean or Japanese citizenship as a plan B, because these are some of the hardest naturalizations on the planet. But that's exactly why their position at the top of the rankings matters so much, because it shapes what everyone thinks a strong passport looks like. So let's go ahead and apply these 3 tests to the top of the 2026 Henley Passport Index and find out what it's actually rewarding. Okay, so Singapore sits at number 1 with 192 visa-free destinations. With this passport, you can travel almost anywhere without a visa, but you can only live in one country, Singapore itself, because there's no regional bloc and no freedom of movement agreement with any neighbors. Singapore also explicitly prohibits dual citizenship for adults, so if you do naturalize there, you would have to renounce everything else. Japan is in joint second place, and the pattern is identical. You can live in one country, Japan, and Japanese law requires its citizens to pick a single nationality. If you acquire another, then you risk losing your Japanese citizenship with no exceptions for adults. South Korea is also in joint second place, and the story is the same again. You can live in one country. The general rule is single nationality with a few narrow exceptions for cases like the over 65s, spouses of Korean nationals, and extraordinary talent cases. But none of those would apply to someone building a strategic plan B. South Korea is discussing liberalization, so this situation could change in the future, but so far today it hasn't. All 3 of the top-ranked passports pass on tourist access, which is what this index measures, but all 3 fail on tests 2 and 3. The rankings are measuring tourist convenience and calling it passport strength. Now, most of you watching this video are not choosing between Singapore, Japan, and South Korea. You're probably American or British, and you want to know where that passport lands on these 3 tests, because it's the passport in your pocket and the starting point for your plan B. So let's run it through. On the first test, tourist access, the US is ranked number 10 on the 2026 Henley Index with 179 visa-free destinations, which is still strong, so it passes that test. But on the second test, the right to live and work in another country, the US gives you the same answer as the top 3. Just one country, the United States itself. There's no regional bloc and no freedom of movement agreement with other countries, so your residency rights pretty much end at the border. On the third test, dual citizenship, the US does permit it, which is where it beats the top 3 on the index outright, on a test that the indexes completely ignore. If you acquire another nationality and you already have US citizenship, you get to keep what you already have. So already the US does better than the top 3 passports on the one test that the indexes don't even look at. But it still fails the second test, which is the one that actually determines whether you have an easy plan B in the first place. So before we get to the most powerful passport that passes all 3 tests and more, There's another case worth looking at because it proves the whole argument better than any theoretical case could. Let's talk about the United Kingdom. So the UK passport is currently ranked at 6th on the 2026 Henley Index, tied with Poland, Hungary, and Malaysia. So according to the index, all of these passports have equivalent strength. But when you apply our 3 tests, that equivalence pretty much completely falls apart. Poland and Hungary each give their citizens the rights to live and work across the 31 countries of the European Freedom of Movement area, while the UK, thanks to Brexit, only covers 2, the UK and Ireland. But on Henley, they rank exactly the same. On the measures that actually matter for a Plan B, Poland and Hungary are roughly 15 times more powerful than the UK. And the story of how the UK ended up being tied with Poland and Hungary is in itself the clearest illustration of what the Henley Index and others like it miss. Britain used to share the number 1 spot with the US back in 2014, I think, and Henley attributes its decline to the effects of broad geopolitical shifts, with Asian and Middle Eastern countries negotiating harder on visa access while Western countries stood still. But that story misses the defining event here. Between 2019 and 2021, when Brexit was in the process of being implemented and Britain lost freedom of movement to the entire EU, the Henley ranking barely moved. The UK's passport shifted by about 1 place at the time, which was pretty much a rounding error. Now run the same period through our 3 tests. On tourist access, the UK passport was still strong, so it passes all of that. But on the right to live and work, before Brexit, a British passport holder had the legal right to live, work, study and retire across 32 countries, which was the entire EU at the time, plus Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Switzerland. But after Brexit, that collapsed to just 2 countries, the UK itself and Ireland through the Common Travel Area, which I'll come back to in a moment. That is a 30-country collapse in strategic value. On dual citizenship, the UK permits it, so it passes that test. But the 30-country collapse showed up as a single-place nudge on Henley. The ranking captured a small tourist access shift from the new Schengen 90 and 180 rules, but the real event, that collapse in residency rights, was basically invisible to the methodology. Anyone who thought of their British passport as a strategic asset woke up on January the 1st, 2021, with a fundamentally weaker document than they'd had the day before, but the index barely flinched. So where does that leave us? Well, the top 3 passports in the Henley Index all fail on tests 2 and 3, but the US makes it further, but it still fails on country count. And the UK is ranked identically to 2 EU passports that unlock 15 times more countries for residency, work, and retirement. So, does any passport pass all 3 tests? Well, there's one in particular that performs amazingly, and it's not where the Henley Index would tell you to look. Let's take a look at that one next. So we know that many of these passport rankings don't distinguish between tourist access and freedom of movement in terms of residency. Both score the same in the methodology, which means a 3-day holiday in Barcelona and the right to live there permanently look identical to Henley. And any EU passport gives you the right to live and work, access healthcare, and start a business and retire across all 27 EU member states, and the EEA extends those same rights to citizens of Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, plus Switzerland's bilateral agreement delivers the same for the Swiss. So that's 31 passports in total, and any one of them unlocks the same 31 countries of full residency and work rights. Even the weakest passport in this zone, sitting somewhere in the low 170s on the Henley Passport Index, still unlocks all 31 countries for residency, work, business, retirement, and study. For anyone building a Plan B, it outperforms the passport ranked number 1 in the world, which means that the rankings basically turn the entire hierarchy upside down. But there's one passport in this zone that goes a bit further than the rest, and that passport is Ireland, which sits in joint 4th place on the Henley Passport Index with 185 visa-free destinations. But measured by the 3 tests that actually matter, it's arguably the most strategically valuable passport in the world at present. As we know, every freedom of movement passport unlocks those 31 European countries, but Ireland alone adds one more through the Common Travel Area rights, which is a pre-Brexit deal unique to Ireland, which was explicitly preserved when every other EU citizen lost their UK freedom of movement rights after Brexit. And the asymmetry here is striking. From the UK side, that arrangement gives you the rights in the UK plus Ireland, so you get just 2 countries. But from the Irish side, you get access to a whole 32 countries, Ireland, the UK, and everywhere else that any European passport gives you access to. So let's quickly run Ireland through those 3 tests. On tourist access, it sits in joint 4th place globally, which is a clear pass. On the right to live and work, Ireland covers those 32 countries, which nothing else on earth can match. And on dual citizenship, Ireland explicitly permits it, multiple citizenships if you like, with no renunciation required. You keep everything you already have, and you add 32 countries of freedom of movement on top. Now, I can already see the comment coming, nice analysis, but I don't have an Irish grandparent. Does that mean I'm stuck? Well, the short answer is no. Most passport indexes won't tell you this, but every passport in the freedom of movement area unlocks the same 31 countries of live and work rights. A Portuguese passport delivers the same strategic value as a German, Norwegian, or Swiss one. And most of them permit dual citizenship too, although the rules do vary by country, and there are some EU nations that do not permit it, like Austria is one that springs to mind. Ireland adds the UK on top, which can be extremely valuable, but the other passports in the zone are still dramatically more powerful than anything outside it, including the US. So the real question here is, which EU freedom of movement passport you can actually get? And there are three main routes to consider when it comes to this. The first one is ancestry. If you have a parent or a grandparent from one of these 31 countries, and in some cases, perhaps a great-grandparent, you might qualify for citizenship by descent. Now, Italy tightened its rules on this in 2025. It used to go back really far, but now those claims are generally limited to having a parent or a grandparent born in Italy, when in the past it let claims stretch back multiple generations. Ireland, Poland, and Hungary still offer accessible pathways. And the second route is residency-based naturalization, which means living legally in one of the countries for a set period, which is usually between 5 and 10 years, learning the language to a certain level, typically A2 or B1 on the Common European Framework, meeting other integration requirements, and then applying for citizenship. Now, Portugal currently has one of the shortest timelines at 5 years, although there are talks in place to double that to 10. So again, this one is uncertain. France also has 5 years, and so do quite a few other countries. Spain offers an accelerated route for native-born citizens of former colonies, but each country has its own rules, which you need to check individually before making a plan. And the third route is investment residency. If you have significant capital, then a small handful of EU countries still offer residency by investment programs that can lead to naturalization over time. But these routes have been closing rapidly, and the ones that remain are not quite what they were 5 years ago, but some of them can still be worth exploring depending on your circumstances. So the right route for you depends on your ancestry, your flexibility to relocate, and your budget, of course. If passport power indexes don't tell you what actually matters, what should you be looking at? Well, you should be looking at whether the passport gives you the right to live and work somewhere, not just visit there as a tourist, and how many countries that freedom of movement covers, and whether you can still hold the new passport alongside your existing citizenship. And that's why having citizenship in the EU freedom of movement area, regardless of which specific country, is so strategically dominant for anyone who's building a genuine plan B. And it's why the frame that many people bring to citizenship strategy is broken, because measuring tourist convenience tells you almost nothing about where you can actually live. If you want to work out which EU citizenship pathway makes the most sense for your situation, I'm building a decision framework that walks you through it, covering which countries you might qualify for, the timelines and requirements, and how to prioritize things based on your precise circumstances. You'll find the link in the description to join the waitlist. And I'll also be doing a full deep dive on Ireland specifically, covering every realistic pathway, who qualifies for each one, and what the process actually looks like in practice. So make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that one. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.